Okay, welcome to our Stay Grounded webinar on airport actions and campaigns, lessons learned on successful strategies and tactics. Today we will be hearing about those tactics and strategies used in anti-airport struggles around the world from people who help doing them. And then we will discuss together with all of us and with the experiences from the different participants on how we can learn from those struggles and what is something we can take to our current resistance fights. So what expects us today? After a brief welcome, we will have a panel with 4 speakers. We have Adam Isham from Safe Maldives, who will share experiences from Safe Mafaru airport struggle. We have Tara from MSTS from the struggle against Fraport in Vila, Nazaré, Porto, Alegre, Brazil. We have Stephen Clark joining us from Bristol Airport Action Network in the UK, and John Jordan from Lazad in France. Thanks to all of you for sharing your experiences today. And just to make it clear right now, what and how success is defined is of course different in different struggles, and therefore not all of the struggles being shared today have been a victory in every terms, but still lessons learned can be surely extracted, and sometimes something that looks like a failure is actually something that you can learn from very much. Afterwards, we will all go into breakout groups to discuss what we can learn from the analysis of our panelists. And at the end, we will draw a summary and have some information on the mapping work of airport struggles that Stay Grounded has been doing. So right now, in spite of climate crisis and global pandemic, a lot of airports still plan to expand, or even new airports are planned to be built. These numbers that I'm showing here, this map is numbers from 2017. It's quite hard to get recent data, where in 2017, more than 400 new airports were planned or under construction. Alone 223 of these in the Asian Pacific region, and 58 in Europe, for example. What this map does not show are further planned runway extensions, new terminals, and terminal extensions. In total, more than 1,200 airport infrastructure projects that were in the pipeline in 2017, and those often leading to noise and health issues, loss of homes and human rights violations, loss of biodiversity and fertile lands, and always fueling climate breakdown. So this is why there's a lot of local resistance going on against those airport or expansion projects. And the idea for this webinar came from a previous Stay Grounded webinar on airport conflicts as struggles for environmental justice. Because these environmental justice conflicts are collective manifestations of discontent when people organize themselves against situations they regard not only as unequal in terms of distribution of environmental benefits, but also as unequal in terms of the distribution of the environmental damages. And Stay Grounded, together in collaboration with the Environmental Justice Map, has mapped more than 300 such conflicts around the world and produced 70 in-depth case studies. Rose, who is here with us today, could tell us much more on this, and will mention a little on the mapping work at the end of this webinar. So I will be sharing in the chat the link to this previous webinar, which I can also highly recommend, and the link to this map that we have produced. This webinar we had on airport struggles as conflicts of environmental justice gave an overview over this research, and we had a look into 3 specific case studies in Southeast Asia, and we touched on overall lessons learned. And from this exchange on lessons learned, we saw that actually it makes a lot of sense to exchange, and we wanted to hear more about different strategies of airport struggles. So that's where this idea came from. And I'm very quickly going to summarize some points that were made at this webinar. So from the research, and Sarah Mingoria, who was presenting that at the webinar, could summarize it much better, but unfortunately she can't be here with us today. It showed that what is perceived as success can be very different in different struggles. It can be a moratorium, a total stop of the airport project. It can also be increasing resistance, or that resistance actually starts. And it could be also compensation, for example, for land loss. That can also be perceived as success in some cases. And of these in-depth case studies that we have mapped, 61% of the cases were not perceived as successful, but almost 39% were perceived as successful. And of those 40%, most of them that actually succeeded had started already organizing preventive. So not only in reaction to the construction, but beforehand. So this gives us already a hint on when to start organizing. And something other that we took away as lessons from this webinar was key questions for organizing strategically around airport projects, that are: who is consulted? Did communities give their prior and informed consent? How can information reach those affected by the project? Who profits from the project and who suffers? Who in the region can actually afford to fly? How is the project financed? Which political actors and companies are involved? And what are moments of mobilization, for example, election campaigns? So I have already mentioned the word of strategic organizing. And maybe before we talk about strategies, we should together define what actually we mean by strategy. So I wanted to ask you if you want to share with me in the chat what strategy actually means for you. So I can't see if somebody's typing. I know it's actually a tricky question sometimes, but I think it's good that we talk about the same thing and make the definitions clear before we go into the discussion. Callum writes, strategy is a joined up plan with tactics, milestones, and goals. And just to mention here now, there are a lot of different definitions of strategy. So there's no right or wrong now here, but it's just important. I see that John wrote, strategy is the directive, design of a campaign within which tactics sit, and agreement from Stephen to that. I'll wait another second. Finlay says, strategy is a clear mission statement. Part of the strategy is a clear mission statement. I can't see if you're still typing, but from what I can summarize, that all of your comments somehow described strategy as a pathway for change. And I'm not going to share a quote by Paulo Freire, which I like a lot about strategy, that says, strategy is or the question is, what can we do today so that tomorrow we can do what we are unable to do today? And Quentin added, strategy is a sequence of actions to achieve a goal. And I have also written up something that we sometimes use in our Stay Grounded discussions. But before that, let me share what Finlay just wrote in the chat, an organization of tasks to achieve an objective. So I think we can all agree on that it's kind of a pathway for change. So that's what I also wrote down, as a strategy is the path we follow to achieve change. Then tactics would be those steps we take on this path, and actions and activities would be single events and are sometimes the only publicly visible elements of a campaign. So a strategy would be, for example, changing the public discourse about aviation or direct action public media work in general. Tactics would be creating and sharing a certain information and expertise, or in general, actives of massive disobedience. And action and activity would then be producing a report on green flying or blocking the opening of a specific airport. And I see that our panelist, Adam, has some issues with connecting. There is one call-in user. Is this Adam? Isham?
No, it's
Somebody
me as
else.
usual.
Okay, this is Steve. Thanks. Then let's hope he will be able to make it with us shortly. Now I'm just going to share the questions for later on in the discussion so that you can maybe keep them in mind too. These are the questions I would suggest. Of course, you can also bring in questions you would like to discuss. How do the strategies and lessons learned that are going to be shared apply to your struggles and struggles you know? And do you know of other inspirational airport struggles and strategies used? Or in case you're involved yourself, what are the strategies used in your struggles? And then maybe we can see if we can find some common principles or not. So that was it from my side. Now I'm happy to start the panel discussion. And for this, we had said we will have one first round where all of our participants tell us briefly about their struggle and what strategies and tactics were key for success, or what lessons they learned from their activities. And then in the second round, the panelists can react to each other, and afterwards we'll open the floor for questions and reactions and comments. So we had planned to start with Isham, but since he has some connectivity issues, maybe we can directly jump to Brazil, to Tara to share her work resisting against Fraport evictions in Vila, Nazaré, Porto, Alegre, Brazil. Tara, can you tell us a little about your struggle and the strategies and tactics you used?
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Tara Burke. I work with MSTS, which is a social movement that's been working for 33 years, fighting for human rights in cities specifically, and promoting the defense and protection of occupied urban areas where people have been dumped, not at their choice, but due to the capitalist model through speculation and gentrification. More than 2,000 families living in a community for more than 50 years have been removed for the extension of a runway to accommodate wide-body planes, using exactly the plot of land where Vila Nazaré is located for the restway at the end of the runway. The violations experienced by the families of Vila Nazaré are numerous. Many of the affected families have lost their livelihoods, now live in the outskirts of the outskirts. They've actually been removed from most of where these pictures have been taken over the past couple of 6 months, over the last year actually. and more than 2,000 families have been resettled. This reality is further exacerbated by the fact that the majority now live in 5-story apartment buildings where some COVID cases have been confirmed. Furthermore, 40 families about 2 weeks ago had to be evacuated under concerns that one of the buildings could collapse. This investigation is still pending, and the families were forced to return while their walls are wobbling, floor tiles have been uprooted, and ceilings have fallen in. The utter disregard experienced by the Nazaré community members epitomizes the reality of the excluded. Your voice is not heard, you have no rights, and now planes take precedence over families and profit is prioritized over lives, or as we're now saying here with Stay Grounded, save people, not planes. Throughout the entire process, the community was invisible, and this needs to change. Throughout the Global South, communities are displaced without their consent on a regular basis. The International Labour Organization 169 Convention is recognized by many countries and is rarely applied, if applied at all. We need an instrument that will hold transnational corporations accountable and allow the excluded the right to recourse. For the past 6 years, there's been a fight internationally to put an end to transnational corporation impunity through a legally binding United Nations Treaty on Transnational Corporations on Human Rights. Something similar to the International Criminal Court, but here corporations will be held accountable, not the state. So many obstacles were encountered during our struggle. We entered the struggle quite late on. The land had already been expropriated by the government. The struggle had been more successful when the entity responsible for the airport was the government. With the coup d'etat in 2016 of the Dilma Rousseff government, privatization started to go very, very quickly, and it took us off guard. We were recuperating from the coup d'etat. Once Fraport took control, the local business and associations and many local government entities had an easier way of making Fraport the monster, and they were no longer the monster. The consultation process that was held should have occurred prior to concession being granted to Fraport. And it should have not been consultation. It should have been a process of obtaining the community's consent. As Mirha said at the beginning when she was speaking, the consent process should be mandatory. It should be prior, before the project's even being discussed, before environmental impact studies, so that people can have an informed decision. People can balance the positives and the negatives, and it must be free of intimidation and co-optation. If this were to have occurred, the fundamental rights of the excluded and their territory would have been respected, and at this point, agreement could or should have been collectively negotiated. The local government's housing department was very abusive and would negotiate with each family individually while also intimidating them. When a subcontracted Brazilian company, namely subcontracted by Fraport, conducted the census, they were accompanied by armed military police. Brazil lived through a military dictatorship for more than 30 years, and the current government is heavily influenced by the military. The list goes on of violations that the people of Nazaré have experienced and still experience today. But as we say in the Global South, defeat after defeat until the final victory. We must look to the positive lessons learned. And here we would like to share all the support that we received through the Ethical Shareholders Germany, through Christian Rousseau's tireless efforts. I think this book is very important. I think it's a discussion that talks about German companies and how they participated in the military dictatorship in Brazil. And I think it's very important. It would be an aspect that Stay Grounded should incorporate, the aspect of neocolonialism. I think that should be a point that we're bringing up eventually. So in addition to the work done by Ethical Shareholders Germany, who represented Vila Nazaré at 2 Fraport AGMs, we'd like to also recognize the work by the Brazilian alternative media. Alternative media is very important, Sul 21 and Brasil de Fato. Friends of the Earth Europe have recently released a case study report promoting a due diligence clause in European law for European companies, where Nazaré is one of the cases. We'll upload that to the Stay Grounded cloud. Stay Grounded and Am Boden Blieben have been denouncing the violations internationally since we made contact with them. We must also recognize the excellent legal work that was carried out by the Brazilian and state public prosecutors. The legal system here in Brazil has its complications, but the Public Defender's Office and the federal and state prosecutors actually did an excellent job in defending as well as they could, considering the judge's decisions around the case. But they did a very, very thorough job in defending the communities and the government's demands. This presentation and the community-led census, we did a community census prior to the airport being privatized, were supported by the architecture department of the University de Rio Grande do Sul, URGS, and its clinic program, Emerging Urban Practices, with Professor Bruno Mello. These lessons learned have been heartbreaking and traumatic, but we know that by denouncing this absurdity, we can only hope that other communities will not be exposed to this cruel and inhuman treatment. I have a couple of points, but I'll leave those for the end just to summarize the lessons learned in a couple of words, but I can leave that for the last 3 minutes if time's up.
Thank you very much, Tara. Thank you a lot for sharing these multifaceted dimension of different strategies being involved into resisting this multinational corporation who puts planes and profit before communities and lives and livelihoods. So I have already noted down some of the things you mentioned, such as having prior, or one of the lessons learned that what would have been necessary is prior consultation where people could take informed decisions, what did not happen in this case.
Consent is the word. Consent's very important. Like a lot of people with the ILO have been trying to mobilize that it's consultation. Consultation doesn't work. Oh, we consulted them. They actually need to obtain consent. They are property owners. They have just as much of a right, and they must be consent. And if they have to give their consent, reparations will be made then at that point before they're removed. So it's part of the whole process. Okay, we don't think of this as an afterthought. So consent is very important that we use that word. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Tara, for bringing that up. It's a very important point. Making visible the neo-colonial structures, putting the national corporations to accountability. You mentioned the necessity to have some kind of instrument of transnational law also, and solidarity work following the money flows, having actually people taking action at the corporate headquarters or in the countries where the multinational companies are based, as well as legal work on the local level, legal prosecution and support of scientific work. So a lot of different strategies you mentioned, and yes, really let's hope that all these experiences gained were not in vain and that others can learn from that. Callum, how is the situation with Adam Isham? Is he joined already?
Not yet, I'm afraid.
Okay, then let's move on to our next struggle, which is a struggle of at least partly victory at one legal level. Stephen will tell us more about the struggle against Bristol Airport. And sorry, I have to jump through the slides showing different, the devastations and so.
Okay, thank you, Mira. I mean, you mentioned how do we define success? Well, in Bristol's case, there's a local planning process where we successfully persuaded the councillors to vote against this application. The airport have now appealed and there's going to be a national process, but we're confident we can resist that as well. So just briefly, what's happening in Bristol? Bristol's an airport of 10 million passengers a year, 9th largest in the UK, so medium-sized airport. They want to expand by 2 million passengers initially, and eventually they want to go to 20 million passengers. The current expansion means an extra 23,000 planes a year, and about 1 million tons of carbon a year. So it's it's a lot. So I just want to bring out a few sort of lessons. I want to go through to the lessons. I think one of the main lessons was we formed a very wide-ranging network. So as well as groups like Extinction Rebellion, non-violent direct action. We also involved people like the Green Party and Greenpeace, the youth strikers. This picture you're looking at now is actually a youth striker demonstration, and they brought loads of energy to the process. So we had a very, very wide network of stakeholders, all of whom were organized individually, but we brought them all together into a network, which became a very powerful thing. Just on a practical level, you see the letters, no airport expansion. They took a lot to make. They're 2 meters high, they're very big. It took a long time to make them, but we used them again and again and again. And they were brilliant. They appeared in press, national press and local press, lots and lots of times. So that's the first point. Bring together all of your individual organizations into a network if you can. The next point I would make is, and it sounds obvious really, concentrate your efforts on the decision makers. Now, Bristol Airport is owned by Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. I don't know why, but the teachers in Ontario own 4 or 5 airports in Europe. So our first thought was to try and influence them. So we did lots of non-violent direct action outside their headquarters in London. We wrote to them and they basically ignored us. So what we decided to do is to give up on them completely. We were wasting lots of energy on them. So we gave up on them and we concentrated on the decision makers, who were the 23 local councillors. And we did a very careful analysis of them. We thought these ones are definitely going to vote against. These ones are going to vote, they want the expansion. So we ignored all those. And there was about 8 or 10 councillors in the middle who were either undecided or we didn't know how they were going to vote. And we concentrated a lot of our effort just on those 10 councillors. And ultimately it worked. We tailored our message to them. So we looked at them individually. We looked at their past political statements, for example. And if somebody was particularly worried about jobs, then we tailored our message to them to talk about jobs. We organized local people to go and talk to them. We organized hundreds of letters. We did love bombing, where we got local school kids to send them postcards with hearts on. Lots. I mean, by the end of it, talking to them, they they'd had enough. They were sort of ready to give in, really. The other way to influence those local councillors is obviously through the media, and we did a lot. We had we had some very good media strategists on board, and we put a lot of pressure on them through the media. Do you want to just move on to the next photo, Mira? I actually forget what the next one is. No, sorry. So this one is another way we brought pressure and got into the media, is through non-violent direct action. So this is the Department of Transport in London. This was an Extinction Rebellion action, and we sprayed that on the wall, and that's criminal damage, and 3 people were arrested because of that. And the reason those people were arrested is because that got us a national media story. So, it sounds pretty drastic, but we got media stories in lots of different ways. Do you want to just move on to the next slide, Mira, next photo? So this is a little tip. We managed to gather 8,000 objections from local people through an awful lot of work. But these objections are sat on a website somewhere. They're digital, obviously. They're sat on a website, and you say 8,000, then it doesn't, and there was about 1,000 people in support. It doesn't really, you don't really compute it or understand it. So what we did was we actually got them all printed out, and all the yellow ones in the yellow books are objections, and the red ones are the supporting comments. And on the night of the actual meeting, we took those books in and put them on the desk in front. So the councillors were constantly reminded of the fact that local people were objecting to this, and they had a visual cue to see it. Next slide, please. So this was, the other thing we found with the media is they really want humor. They really, particularly the national media, actually, the national media are really interested in humor. So you will know that this is an ostrich. When ostriches are threatened by something, they put their head in the sand. And this was supposed to represent the climate deniers, the people who won't accept what's happening with aviation. And this picture, with loads of people around it, got in 3 or 4 national papers. Again, it was putting pressure on the local councillors. Just want to go on again, please, Mira? Oh, sorry, that's not mine, so go back. So we did some other things. So we found some local well-known people. So people may have heard of the band Massive Attack, their local Bristol band. And we talked to them and they said, yeah, we're against this. So they started to tweet for us. And they've got like 3 million people on their Twitter account. So we started to get hundreds of objections through that medium. Greta spoke in Bristol about Bristol Airport and tweeted about us. Now she's got about 8 million Twitter followers. We were overwhelmed with the support we got after that. So just have a think, who lives locally, who's well known, and just go and approach them. I mean, the worst that can happen is they say no. So that was an important thing that we did. Yeah, I think those are the main tips that I would have. I think the most important thing is the really bringing together the stakeholders and trying to present a united front with all the objectors. So bring together a network and really listen to what people in those networks, what organizations who join that network, what they really think and what their objectives are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks for bringing a lot of very practical hands-on tips. So I think building a network, I'm sure that Tara and John can also talk a lot about that and surely share this analysis. What I found interesting was that you also mentioned to put care into the materials you produce and produce them in a way that they're reusable with this example of the letters you shared. Thinking wisely about whom you address with your communication, and not, for example, talking to the airport or the airport stakeholders, but to those who actually decide on if the airport is going to be built, and having tailored messages to every single one you talk to, or to the specific target groups. And then, of course, you mentioned influencing the public discourse via the media, through direct actions, through civil disobedience, and also bringing in humor or thinking of other ways of how to convey your message. And also thinking of creative ways of how to make the voice of those affected visible with this message you had with these printed signatures. And yeah, thinking of who to contact locally, celebrities, who could get involved, that has a lot of reach. So thanks a lot for all these practical tips. And we will end the round for now with John, who will tell us more about the successful struggle against an airport in France at Notre-Dame-des-Landes. And then all of you just feel free to comment on each other's lessons learned shared. So let me just go to John's slides. John, the floor is yours. John, if you're speaking, you're still muted.
There we are. That's a bit better.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation and the incredible work that Stay Grounded is doing. this was an impossible ask as well, to describe the tactics and strategies of a 40-year-long struggle in 5 minutes. But then probably cancelling this international airport also seemed like an impossible task 40 years ago, or over 40 years ago. So I'm going to try to do this in 5 minutes. This is my version of what the strategies and tactics that worked. You could talk to many people in the movement and have different views. And of course, this is very particular. All these struggles are situated struggles. All these struggles are different. They're in different political, different cultural, and different ecological contexts. So here we're in Western France. It's an airport planned in 1974. A new international airport for Nantes, and it's going to destroy 1,650 hectares, about 4,000 acres of wetland and farmland and forest. For the first period, the first forms of resistance against this airport were peasant farmers who refused to expropriate be expropriated, and the airport kept coming back on the scene, and then coming off the scene, and then in 2000 it comes back as a green airport, of course, with green roofs and eco compensation, etc. And at that moment, a citizens group sets up called ASIPA, and they do information, classic information stuff. They do vigils. They do a couple of demonstrations. And what happens immediately is there's a desire for diversity. And I think one of the most important strategic questions here on the ZAD, which enabled us to win, was the taste for true diversity, the taste for really having diverse tactics and a diverse composition of networks and movements. So what happens is in 2008, a group of people who were living on the territory decide to write a letter inviting people to come and squat the territory, because they say to defend a territory, you have to inhabit it. You can't just let it be deserted. People are moving out. People are selling their farms to the airport, etc. So there's an invitation. And then what happens is there is, and I think this is another thing, is construct desire. Don't be just against an airport. Show what you want instead. So there's this kind of construction of yes, this is the world we want, and no, we don't want an airport. And what happens, start to squat and build farms and bakeries and so on. And in 2012, there's an attempted eviction. And at that attempted eviction, called Operation Caesar, several thousand cops coming to try and evict the zone, there is a diversity of tactics, and it comes back to this diversity. It's not, there's people blocking the roads with tractors, there's people in the trees, there's local people singing songs, there's people building barricades, there's sabotage, there's stones, there's burning barricades, there's non-violent blockades, there's everything. And the fact that we kept these complementary tactics throughout the struggle after 2012 was really important. We didn't let the government divide us between the radicals and the locals, or between the citizens and the revolutionaries. And that was utterly key. So Operation Caesar wins. We stop the police evicting. It's a long story, I can't go into anything. But one of the things we also learned there was also always be one step ahead. Other key strategic thing, always be one step ahead. And be one step ahead meant, in this case, when we knew they were going to come at some point and evict, we said a year before they came, we said, if they come and try to build the airport, we will rebuild. So they already destroyed 12 farmhouses during Operation Caesar. And we'd always said 1 month later, we will come back and rebuild. And 1 month later, 40,000 people came back and rebuilt an entire hamlet. So always stay one step ahead of the enemy, one step ahead of the destroyers. Absolutely key part of the strategy. So basically the composition, what does it mean to have a composition? Think of compost. What does compost do? It transforms things. You get transformed in compost. A composition comes from the Latin, comes from together, and it comes from place. You're together in a place, and you have to be open to transforming each other. So in this incredible composition, you had farmers, you had squatters, you had naturalists, you had anarchists, you had vegans, you had dairy farmers, you had anti-tech people, and you had people who wanted to have compound tractors. You had all different kind of groups in this composition. And the key was that we had a taste for diversity and we were prepared to transform ourselves, but not to try and convince the others to be like you, but to be able to be transformed. So always seeking out a kind of complementarity. And so what happens is the ZAD, after the Operation Caesar, the police go away and they don't come back for 6 years. So for 6 years, we have this zone of the zone to defend, we call it, and we build another world. The slogan is against the airport and its world. And so there are bakeries, pirate radio stations set up. There are farms. There are rap studios. There are cheese making. There's a whole culture of resistance that builds itself on this land, which they want to be an airport. So the key there is you construct the desire. You're not just against the airport. You're showing another world, and that constructs desire and therefore constructs movements. And the movement after Operation Caesar had become a national movement. There are 150 different local groups. What happens is 2016, all the legal challenges are over. And this was also super important, that there was always the legal challenges, the direct action, and the information. And the legal challenges are all over. We lost 175 legal challenges, 178, but we still were going to fight the airport. And in 2016, they said they were going to come and build in the autumn. And so again, always one step ahead. They say in January 2016 that all the legal challenges are over. It's the green light, they're going to come. So we put 20,000 people, 1,000 bikes and 500 tractors on the main bridge of Nantes and block it for a day. They clear it out with tear gas and water cannons as per usual in France. And then the next month, February, we put 60,000 people on the motorway, just where we knew they would put the first spade in the ground to start the work. 60,000 people, huge party on the motorway. A few months later, we train 1,000 people in how to defend the zone. And a few months later, we get 40,000 people in October to come and put a stick in the ground and pledge they're going to come back if the government wants to come and build the airport. And 20,000 sticks are put in the ground in this kind of ritualistic way. And that's, and then the airport is then passed on to the next government. And in the end, 2018, it is cancelled. And then there's a revenge attack, but we haven't got time to talk about that. But one of the keys, I think, is to keep that composition together. The government will try always to separate the radicals from the citizens, or separate you. Keep that composition together, but don't try and be all the same. Always complement each other. And I think I'd like to end here with a quote from one of the farmers who resisted, who said, "That's how I resist, by keeping working till the police arrive. Whether we like it or not, we have become more than ourselves." And I think it was that capacity to really be open for transforming ourselves that really made all the difference. And the one step ahead also meant that in 2014, 4 years before the airport was cancelled, the movement, this really diverse movement, produced a thing which said, because there will be no airport, 6 points for the future of the ZAD. That was a document, because there will be no airport. And the key strategy of all this is exactly the same as magic. You believe that you will win. You imagine you will win. And you're prepared for that victory. And so we put these 6 points for the future of the ZAD, that this zone would not be an airport. It would be diverse forms of agriculture, diverse forms of living, and it would be run as a commons, not as a private airport, but a commons that gave more fertility, more life to everyone, both human and non-human, who lived on the ZAD. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for having made this attempt of sharing 40 years of resistance with us in a very brief time, and for giving this overview. And also thanks for making it transparent that this is your personal story. And I think that probably applies to all the lessons learned shared here, that on every struggle, there are multiple perspectives, and we can only always share our own. Thanks for raising this key principle of diversity of tactics and being complementary until the end. I liked really this metaphor you used of compost and composing, not trying to convince others, but being open and to getting transformed in this process of collaboration as well. And I think that's something also Stephen also mentioned in saying that building a huge network and really listening to each other and really taking each other seriously in the collaboration. And as also already Tara and Stephen mentioned, the different kind of approaches complemented each other, like the legal approach, the direct action, and the information. And I really liked what he also said about being persistent, like losing 178 legal challenges, but still keeping on and trying again, because you have this visionary, imaginative that you're actually going to win. So having this very strong vision that there was built. And of course, it's very different in the case in Vila Nazaré. It was very different because on this territory, there was already kind of the positive visions of the families living there and having their livelihoods. So it probably depends whether you still have to create something or just saving something from destruction. And last but not least, very interesting to always plan a step ahead. I think often probably we are not even prepared that we can be as successful as we are, and then the next step is not yet planned or prepared, or it can be so very, very interesting and very important. So I would now leave the floor to you three panelists, since we have not heard anything else from Adam, unfortunately. I will share later in the chat the case he was going to present, because there's a written down version of it, so we can also read that later. But for now, maybe Tara, John, and Stephen, would you like to still react to each other's presentation?
I can't see anyone.
Oh yeah, sorry, I will stop the screen sharing. Thanks a lot for that. So I see Tara also wrote in the chat, very good point, creating the ZAD brought the sense of being a commons, not only mine. I see Stephen has raised his hand. Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, Tara, I really liked your the distinction you drew between consultation and consent. They sound almost the same kind of words, but actually they're quite different. We have consultation in the UK, and it's what we call tick box consultation. In other words, you decide the answer you want to get. You go and ask. You form a question that means you're going to get that answer. And then you ask the people you think are going to give you the right answer. So in Bristol, for example, they did a consultation, and the way they did it was they stood by the arrivals terminal in the airport with a clipboard, and they asked the people as they came through, would you like a newer terminal building with better facilities and shops? And people coming through after their holidays, obviously they said yes. 90% of them said yes. They then put out a press release that said 90% of people approve of our plans. And we thought, really? So we looked down into the detail of that and we found out, and of course it made them into a laughing stock, because it was so ridiculous. So I really like that, that distinction.
I think that's very important. I had this experience in Guatemala, because Guatemala has worked really, really hard with the International Labor Organization's 169 convention. And they, about 3 or 4 years ago, they actually held a referendum in a community where there was going to be a mining project, and the community voted against it. So it's very important, that differentiation between.
This is fascinating discussions in relationship to the ZAD, because what happened, I mean, we had the tick box stuff in the 70s, it comes throughout the process, French government do all the tick box stuff as normal. But then once it had been legally agreed on the airport, what happened was in 2016, this crazy year where they said they were going to come in October or come back in October to build it. After the actions that we did in the winter, in the summer, suddenly the president goes, "Whoa, okay, we're going to do a referendum." So he calls, the president just goes on TV, calls for a referendum, even though it's illegal to call for a referendum for something that's already been legally agreed to. And then he changes the wording a bit, and they do this kind of referendum, obviously only asking the local regions that they know they'll win. So it's not a national referendum. They leave out one of the regions that paid for the airport, and they knew that if they'd asked them, Brittany, they would have lost. But the reason they pushed the referendum was they learned from the Stuttgart 21 struggle that actually the referendum split the radicals from the citizens, because they did a referendum, they vote for the airport, and everyone was like, oh, yes, now that's democracy. So they captured you with democracy. And I think, don't let them do that. And they did it, that 55% were voted for the airport, but the movement, and I remember the day we were all in this barn, hundreds of people in this barn, and the movement, the info came up on the screen, and everyone was just resist, resist, resist. You know, the farmers, the ex-mayors, the anarchists, the communists, everyone was just resist, resist, resist. So we didn't let them capture us with referendums. And I think we need to be very careful with that.
Thanks a lot also for showing this potential traps also that can be included in such a, in this case, consultation and not really prior and informed consent process. I see that there is already a star in the chat by Finlay, and I would now also hand over to all of you who, as we have learned before, many of you are also involved in your local struggles, to now just comment or either if you have questions to the panelists, then please raise them and say to whom your questions are addressed, or just make comments from your perspective. And Finlay, since you've raised your hand first, please go first.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, to what you often hear about airports that the argument is it's producing jobs, but how much people that were local that were actually in favour, how much of that was because they believed they were going to get a job from it, or do you think that actually wasn't such a big deal and it's just being overplayed by the corporations that run airports?
And this question is for...
I'll do for John.
Okay.
Of course, they always use the jobs and the economy argument. What was interesting is that actually, no, the people who voted for it, it actually in the region, it became a huge issue that even families were divided over it. I mean, it was a big deal in the region. So it became more than just jobs and ecological questions and climate questions. And mostly it was nourishing food questions. It was mostly, this is land that could produce food and it's going to produce an airport. It was less of a climate debate. But we also worked with the unions. We even in the end got the union from Vinci, the multinational who were meant to build the airport, on our side. You know, so the whole thing about, you know, jobs was slightly complicated because they were saying, actually, this is rubbish because what happens with a new airport? You get more automation and you get less jobs. So, you know.
That's interesting. So you won the unions on the automation argument.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And Stephen also wants to react on that.
Yes, good question, Finlay. And it was the hardest point to argue against, really. We argued against it. Most of the jobs are, you know, minimum wage, 0 hours contract. Those in the UK will know what that means. So they're not very good jobs, you know, good jobs. There also aren't that many of them because of automation, as John has mentioned. But what we tried to say is look at the sort of wider economic aspects of expanding the airport. And one of the useful things we did was we looked at how tourists leaving the region spend all their money elsewhere. Therefore, airports are like a huge way of moving your economic success to a different country. And people, you know, instinctively, they hadn't really understood that because they see airports as being, you know, huge economic hubs. Actually, they're economic hubs to take your prosperity to somewhere else.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. Oh, sorry, Finlay, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, so you mean sort of people in Bristol that have free money to spend, they then don't spend it in shops and restaurants in Bristol, but go and spend it in Spain instead?
Well, yeah, we've got this at the moment because of COVID. We've got international lockdown. We're not allowed to go anywhere. So many of, I mean, not right now, but when we weren't in lockdown, but we were allowed to travel locally, not internationally. All the local places, all the local tourist resorts around here were, did fantastically well because people went there to spend their money rather than going to Gran Canaria.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. I see that Callum has also raised his hand. Was that directly to this jobs discussion? Yeah, please.
Yeah, so just a brief, I'm just thinking that the jobs and the economic benefits is obviously quite differentiated globally, and it links to the whole tourism discussion, which is so related. And somewhere like the UK, there's an obvious economic benefit to less people traveling away and spending money elsewhere. But obviously, as has been touched on, I think it's certainly in other workshops this weekend, in areas where the economy is more dependent on tourism, there's a very different discussion there about the economics. And actually you end up potentially, from one perspective, cutting off economic kind of inflows. I'm not suggesting that that's in any way a sustainable kind of model, but it's a very different discussion that I think it's just a good way of highlighting the local dynamics of a lot of these discussions.
Thanks a lot, Callum. And yeah, thanks a lot also for bringing up that, of course, not all the lessons learned are applicable everywhere, and that it depends a lot to the local context also. Just one thing on this economic argument, I recall, and maybe I can dig it up for you, there was a document written on the lessons learned on the Heathrow airport struggle. And one of the key messages was also, don't be afraid of the economic arguments and also use them, because very often actually the economic arguments presented by the aviation industry are very biased also, and actually you can also argue with economic arguments against airport projects quite easily. But talking of jobs, I just wanted to know maybe of Tara, like how was the discussion in Vila Nazaré on this issue? I know you mentioned that the airport was mainly also built for cargo, right?
Well, this was our impression. The airport has been the extension has been under consideration. I don't know exactly for how long, probably more than 20 years. And then it really became an issue around the World Cup in 2014. So, but there was no way they could have gotten it done on time. And then with the coup d'etat, the interim government, the de facto government of Michel Temer, started privatizing everything, and the airports were the first thing. And so the communities really never had a discussion around it. I remember going to one public hearing that was held at the state legislature in 2016, I think, before the coup. And they were getting information. It was mostly the local business people that were involved. There was another faction that was interested in getting a different airport further outside of Porto Alegre to be the cargo airport. But there were interest in people having that land purchased. It was their own land that they wanted purchased. And so jobs were never a consideration. Most of the people that lived in Nazaré worked from recycling. They worked within the community. They work in security. They were not the people getting jobs at the airport. So tourism was an aspect, because Porto Alegre, Brazil does mostly internal tourism. People don't really travel as much outside. There's so much to see here in Brazil. So that argument wouldn't necessarily work, because it's more of a national consideration. They wanted people to come. But I do really think it works around the cargo. They don't talk about it, but Southern Brazil doesn't have any cargo facilities. Sao Paulo chews it all up. So they can't work Uruguay, they can't work Argentina. And one of the things that Fraport put in their report was that they were incorporating some sort of mechanized machinery for removing goods from Porto Alegre, like some machine that would read something. I don't know what it was. But so that points to, without them saying it, we don't have the same access to information here like you guys do. We can't get this information. We can't go and you have to go and find somebody to do you a favor that works for the airport agency, and it's very, very complicated. Your struggles are so much like, I think we ended up getting more information when we started working with you guys in Germany through Christian, because he had access to Fraport. We had this is part of the problem in the South. You can't get the information. By the time you get the information, the whole thing's already over. It's really frustrating.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for sharing this very different reality also, and the problem of how to get hold of information. I think that's something also for every struggle, but definitely difficult, more difficult in global South countries. Thanks. And John, you wanted to? No, you're still on mute, please. Yeah.
I think
Steve also wanted to say something.
Oh, we'll go on then. Well,
no, you first, John. It's Steve from
okay.
Rising Tide.
Hi, Steve. Yeah, just, well, I mean, a kind of another thing around jobs, and one of the strategies that was quite interesting for the ZAD in 2013, we were inspired by the animal rights movement strategy in the UK, which is basically, that to realize that multinationals rely on subcontractors these days. And actually multinationals have very, very good PR. They have good economy. They have loads of money. It's much harder to get down the multinational. How do you take down the multinational? You go for the subcontractors. So we did this thing called adopt a subcontractor. And we asked local people to find the subcontractors for Vanity who are going to come and build the airport and go and do actions, sabotage, whatever they felt was okay for them to do. And that was super powerful. Loads of subcontractors started pulling out before anything happened because they're much weaker, and they can't afford to have actions against them or not be popular locally. So that wasn't exactly giving jobs to people, but it worked very well.
Thanks. And I see that Callum shared in the chat that also this worked very well for the case of fracking in the UK. Mm-hmm. So some very inspiring examples of how to grasp those multinational corporations who seem so big, but then once you see whom they actually depend on, it gets easier to counter them, really. I see that Anne has raised her hand. Anne, please.
I think Steve was before me.
Yeah, very sorry. Please then Steve first and then Anne.
Oh, hi. Yeah, this is with my London City Airport, Southwest Essex Fighter Flights hat on. When London City Airport published their master plan, which is like a stage before the planning process in the UK, there were, because it's a city airport and it's in the middle of London, the economic case was absolutely essential. So we did a crowdfunder to raise money to get CE Delft to write a report to look into the economic aspects of the plan, and it definitely was money well spent. They completely rubbished it. Found that the airport had overestimated the economic benefits by 50%. £200 million less than the airport had claimed. They obviously failed to factor in the costs of noise, air pollution and climate change aspects. They overclaimed the number of jobs. I think absolutely every airport ever built has overclaimed the number of jobs that result. They're usually in coffee shops anyway, mostly. And they failed to back up any of their claims about the trade benefits of expansion, which I think is particularly important in cargo airports like Manston coming up in the UK soon. And they'd also overclaimed the benefits to the national economy. So that report's available, and I'll email it to the online account for Stay Grounded, and someone can put it in the chat if you want to have a look at it. The other thing I would say about what Steve said about Bristol Airport, I think they were incredibly lucky that they had any councillors that were interested at all. With City Airport, it's in Newham, 100% Labour council, no opposition at all, literally. They have a mayor that runs things, totally controlled things at the time. And when we got to the first planning meeting, there were 8 people on the planning committee. The quorum is 3. 5 of them had to step back because they had to declare an interest in receiving money from the airport. So that left 3 people, the minimum quorum. And the only question that they asked that could have anything to do with the environment was how many parking places will be provided at the new airport. So I would say that don't forget the officers, because if you've got stupid councillors or ignorant councillors, and ignorance can be cured by education, then they're going to rely on what the officers say or the officers lead. So if you can find fertile ground with one of the officers, then that's another good avenue to go down.
Steve, maybe for those who are joining internationally, could you define the difference between councillor and officer?
Sorry, yeah. So councillors, people that are elected for the people that vote in their area, and the officers are the people whose job it is to work for the council, run the council, provide briefing for the councillors in order to make their allegedly democratic decisions. So sometimes they'll just completely rubber stamp whatever the officers have put in front of them. And I think that happens quite a lot in local authorities up and down the UK. So I think basically with economic arguments and with priming the council, get your retaliation in first.
Thanks a lot. And thanks for sharing this idea. It sounds a little familiar, like the principle of looking whom the multinational corporations depend on, whom do the councillors depend on the officers, and influencing them on that level. So yeah, thanks. And now I will hand over to Anne. In case you're already talking, Anne pulled back. Sorry, I hadn't seen that. So in the chat, I have shared a study made by the New Economic Foundation on Bristol airport expansion. I think it's another such document which really gives more perspective on an airport expansion than just from the industry. Thanks, Stephen, for bringing it up. And yeah, just a minor comment on that.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that. So we the airport produced this very expensively produced document produced by experts, PhDs, doctors, professors, and so on. And normally, lots of numbers and so on. And normally, most campaign groups would say, "Oh my God, I don't understand this," or they might get somebody to look at it. But basically, because it looks pretty and it's got lots of numbers, people tend to believe it. Actually, when Neff looked at it, it was exactly the same as what Steve just mentioned there. The good stuff was exaggerated hugely. The benefits were exaggerated hugely, and you could only get that if you had another academic group or another people who understood the process to actually look at the original report. So that was a lesson for us.
Thanks a lot.
It cost a lot of money. It cost about £10,000 to get it done, but it was money well spent.
So that's something that Steve also said. It was money well spent.
That only cost 4.
Yeah, of course, that's another question, like where to get money from. But I'll just read out what Anne said in the chat, saying that also in Germany, when evicting Hambach forest tree houses, so the squats preventing the open pit coal mining in Germany in an ancient forest, people targeted the companies who provided the machines for the tree evictions and were quite successful with this. So that's another example of thinking around a second corner on where to attack. And Tara also shared, I think that was related to the officers and councillors, that it's good to start at the local level because business accountably works locally. So I have the feeling that right now it's always more or less the same people participating in the discussion. And now to maybe even open it up a bit more, we could go into the breakout rooms. Sorry that I'm switching back and forth because there are still comments that come in the chat. Callum said, it's interesting that at the ZAD, they even did it before the event started, or before eviction started. They started already adopting subcontractors, and maybe that's something we can keep in mind from the principle that John mentioned, like being one step ahead. Great. So give a brief overview on, a quickly brief overview on the mapping work that Stay Grounded does together with the Environmental Justice Atlas as one possibility of making airport struggles visible. And Rose, do you want me to share the presentation again?
Please, yeah, if you could. I think they're on your folder, yeah.
Yes, I'll do that in a second. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, this was shown at the beginning of the plenary yesterday, and it just, you know, it just indicates just how many airport struggles there are and the geographical spread. And one thing it does is it actually, where possible, documents the organisations that are involved. And I mean, we've talked about many of them in this session, and the range and how, you know, how important and sometimes difficult it is to get the broad range of people and organisations opposing these projects, you know, sort of working together. But there's a, you know, absolutely tremendous range of civil society organisations, campaigning organisations, residents groups, farmers groups. So that's one thing that we can actually do with this this mapping aviation conflicts. So if we just look at the next one, please, Mira. Yeah, another thing it does is where possible include details of the firms that are involved in these projects. So here we have the Vinci Group, and there you can see the Portugal Tagus Estuary Airport, which has been mentioned, and also, but it brings in other types of conflicts, because, you know, it's not just airports, there's other mega projects with Vinci, often to do with transportation. And then down, if you actually scroll down, which I won't do, but the Nantes Airport and the ZAD is also, it's been brought together in this way. And so if someone wants to research this firm, they will find the different airport and other projects that Vinci is implicated with. So if you have the next one, please. This is another one looking at the environmental conflicts where Total South Africa is involved. And on the top right, you'll see the airport built specifically to serve the liquid natural gas project on the Cabo Delgado. And that's one of the key components of that project. And of course, Total SA is a subsidiary of the French firm Total. And so, you know, we're starting to, I think, you know, it helps us to build links with other struggles, with other fossil fuel projects, and to highlight the role of aviation in the extractives industry. And then finally, just to remind us that, you know, it's, in a way, it's alarming that there are so many struggles against airport projects, and so many serious cases of injustice and often human rights abuses, which are very serious. But on the other hand, it's really good that we're actually using the spatial information to help build up and strengthen our network. And yeah, just to urge people, you know, even if we don't know much about a potential conflict, do share the information with the network, because we might be able to piece something together and use the network to actually raise contact with people that are involved locally if we haven't already got that connection.
Thank you very much, Rose, for making a case and showing what mapping as a strategy and showing visual information about airport struggles can actually bring, and can also bring in terms of movement building, connecting aviation to other issues and getting connected to other groups around the world. I will now share in the chat also some other examples. Thank you, Rose, and also thanks to Sarah, who is not here yet, who have been coordinating this research work. There are some other very inspirational stories from around the world that are included in the Environmental Justice Atlas, for example, from Aranmula Greenfield Airport in Kerala, India, where local protests stopped the expansion project, and some others. So in case you still want to have some inspiring reading after the webinar, feel free to dive into all these cases. And I can just say thank you to all of us, thanks to our panelists and to all of you for participating in this. And at least for me, I have heard a lot of very interesting principles that I can take back to my local struggle, of course, thinking about how it could be applied to the local context. One very important one was this principle of prior and informed consent that is also not being gained without being manipulated. The idea of following the money, getting from the attacking the pillars of support of multinational corporations or of decision makers. So doing actions or doing interventions at the local level, building large networks, building solidarity, and accepting diversity within these networks to really collaborate and be open for the process and being transformed in the process. Having different kind of strategies at the same time who actually complete each other. For example, pursuing the legal and the direct action and the information or scientific work at the same time. Don't forget about humor, especially also when thinking about media interventions, and talking to people who might be able to support your cause, who have maybe a bit larger reach, like celebrities. Always thinking a step ahead, so planning the next step and the reaction to it, which also then takes us to this bigger vision that is very important to have the already envision what we really want and embody the conviction or the embody being sure that we will actually win our struggles. And in this vision, it's important to include like questions of jobs, questions of economy and tourism, and not being afraid of this economic argument. Well, that's what I took from it. I'm sure there's a lot of other things that you will hopefully take home, and I thank all of you for this great and fruitful discussion.